amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello and welcome, listeners. As always, it's wonderful to be with you, and my guest today is Trevor Hamley. Trevor is the author of a terrific book called Vodka in a Vegemite Jar. Isn't that an amazing title? And you might wonder why anyone would call a book that, but when you hear Trevor's story, you will understand why. In 1983, as a glaciologist, Trevor embarked on a 3,000-kilometre Soviet Antarctic return over snow traverse from Mirny to Dome Sea with the Russians, wasn't it? In his memoir, Trevor reveals how fate propelled him towards this unique experience, including a visit to Vostok, the Russian base, the coldest place on Earth. And you're starting to get a picture as to why he called his book Vodka in a Vegemite Jar. Just reading his freezing cold story is enough for me to reach for the vodka bottle, or jar as it is in this case. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you.
Now, tell us how you ended up doing this amazing trip to Antarctica. You were only very, very young, newly married, and what exactly is a glaciologist?
Good question. It's not a profession well known in Australia, the only continent that doesn't have a glacier. I did civil engineering at university, but always had this ambition to go to Antarctica after watching a slide presentation by my physics teacher at school. That was a driving force. That's what I mean by fate, I suppose, in a way. When I finished university, I applied to the Antarctic Division to become a glaciologist and spent a year at Casey in 1978. That was the preceding pre-qualification, if I could call it that, for being able to go on the Soviet trip. Obviously, the Soviet trip was very unusual, and you needed to be left to your own devices a fair bit, so you needed to be experienced. So that's how it happened, really, in 1983.
And how old were you then? 24?
I was 29 when I went on the Soviet trip.
And you went on the Nella Dan, didn't you?
I did.
Yes. We used to live in Hobart and in a unit that looked down over where the Nella Dan is. She's a sturdy little ship.
Well, it's a beautiful ship. It really alarmed Kerry when she saw Nella for the first time. Yeah. It was low tide at Macquarie Wharf, and I actually walked down the gangplank. I talk about that in the book a bit. Yes. But Kerry, if you'd seen her we'd only been married. We got married in January and I left in November, so it was, 10 months or something. And she thought that was it, never going to see me again.
Well, a lot of people got very seasick, didn't they, on the way down there? You were okay because the food sounded so it was absolutely yummy on there. So pity to be so seasick you couldn't enjoy it. Exactly.
It was quite common for people to hit the bunk as soon as the ship, whether it was Nella or Tala or any of the other ones, left either the river or the Port Phillip Bay in the older days. And once you hit the waves and the swell and those ships started to roll, right, people would often hit the bunk and you wouldn't see them again for 10 days or 2 weeks until you arrived at the ice.
As you say, it's an incredible piece of water. Is she still in service? She's not, I don't
Nella
think.
Dan sunk at Macquarie Island, I don't remember what year, but shortly after it was, yes. Yeah. It was a very sad way for that vessel to go. It was one of the longest serving Antarctic vessels of all time. And, it was a wonderful ship. It was small. Yes. But as you said, the meals were incredible. And the whole way the Danes ran those ships was great fun to be part of that. Just the trip down there was exciting. It would have been trout for lunch and all sorts of nice things there. But now tell me, when you actually arrived there, you had a very unfortunate accident, didn't you? Yes, I went to Mawson to get collected by the Russians, and I didn't know how long I'd be waiting. And obviously, after the first day went by and the second day, I started to find things to do, including a bit of sightseeing. And this particular day, I went out on the sea ice with a few other guys in over snow, quad bikes, and some guys had go-karts. And, I fell off this. We had an accident. I crashed into a guy in front of me on a quad bike and went over the handlebars and smashed my head. So it was a very poor way to start the... Absolutely. Because I had really bashed my head and had a big black eye and 7 stitches. So when the Russians saw me and I had sunglasses and a beanie on, they wanted to know what that was all about. But, who on earth have they got here joining them? Yeah. They no longer have huskies there. No, the huskies were removed as part of the treaty in 1995, I think it was. Mawson was either the last or one of the last stations to have huskies. They were really there just for recreational, purposes in the end. Not really any practical purpose. That's why they were fairly rare in most stations.
You had one called Snoopy.
Correct. That was a dog that we took back to Mearney as a pet. That came about. The OIC was on the plane, and when he saw the dogs and the fact that there was this new litter of puppies, he was very opportunistic and asked if he could take one back. Their dog had just passed away. They had a pet who'd passed away, and he thought, this is a great chance to perhaps, replace it. So the doctor and the dog handler had a quick discussion and selected not a puppy, but a dog that was a little bit older that they felt would be well suited to, had the right temperament for being a pet, because some of the dogs didn't. Some of them were a bit aggressive and so on.
Right. You'd certainly, yes, as you say, you need to have the right temperament. Now, you spoke no Russian, did you? Or very little?
I learnt to speak Russian in the 6 months preceding the trip. But in that period of time, you can only hope to have a basic understanding. And, of course, when I arrived at Mearney, it was a real struggle for words to come out. They just, anybody who's tried to learn a second language will understand that, I think. But by the time I'd finished the expedition, I'd describe it as able to converse in a basic level, not technically, or I would regularly have to tell them to slow down and say that again and so on. But, there was such an interesting experience, that being on the other end of that cultural divide, and finding myself with these guys looking at me as if I'm an idiot and raising the volume and speaking with some stupid intonation and accent. You have to think that would help me understand, where it just made things worse.
Yes. But Vlad spoke some English, didn't he?
Vlad spoke English. He thought his English was pretty bad, but in comparison to my Russian, it was damn good.
It would be a very difficult language, I imagine. Then the problem, as you say, is any language, and if you go to the country and you're trying to speak it, everybody's speaking so fast and it's a bit of slang thrown in and whatever. It's almost impossible to keep up, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, but for example, when we were driving along on the Traverse, one of the Serge, the mechanic, and I travelled in the cabin of this vehicle for quite a long time, and he decided it'd be fun to try to help me improve my vocabulary. So each day I'd attempt to learn 2 new words, and every time we stopped to do some measurement of a snowpole accumulation or whatever it was, I'd try to say something in Russian, or he'd say something to me, and we'd try to practice those 2 words. Yeah, and by doing so, try and build up my knowledge. When we got back to the station, this is another part of the story, it looked like we may actually be we were in great danger of having to stay through the winter because it was so late when we got back and the ship was having trouble coming in. And I felt that, well, my marriage could be in jeopardy here.
But you'd learn Russian.
I might learn Russian. It wasn't a good trade-off, I didn't think.
No, well, I was going to come to that later, but now that we're talking about it, yes, I thought you took that very well, that you might be there for another year. And you say, yes, but, on the upside, I'd learn Russian, but on the downside, I may not have a wife waiting for me when I got home.
Yes.
So what did Kerry think, initially when you said, as you said, you were newly married and this was a great adventure for you, but obviously a very worrying time and probably a lonely time for her. It's a bit like
it was.
My husband went off to Vietnam for a year or something, which he did. It's hard for the wife left behind. Yes,
it was. Well, she was teaching and that was her first or second year, I can't remember, but really early. And at least she had a job, but to preoccupy and keep, and we had a home in Mount Eliza. But it was lonely there because the house was a family home on a treed block, and so she felt insecure, did feel lonely. Her family were in Sydney, so they weren't readily close by.
And it was hard, obviously long before the days of Skype and, even email. So it was hard to keep in touch, wasn't it? And I know you say in your book that a few times that you would eventually get to a radio where you could ring her. And, of course, she didn't know you were going to ring her, so she may not be available, and then you'd have to wait forever to be able to talk to her again. It was hard to communicate, wasn't it?
Exactly. I couldn't give her – we had a prearranged sched time. When I say we, I had arranged this with a radio amateur radio operator in Frankston, close to home. And so I had this prearranged sced time, but because we were travelling and our movements were unpredictable and the radio propagation conditions were also unpredictable and difficult from a place like that, it was pretty hard to make these regular sceds. So it was definitely an opportunistic thing. I couldn't give Kerry warning that I'd actually be calling. I just hoped that maybe Earl, who was on the other end, could give her a ring on the phone and say, come over, Trevor's on the radio. Right. But that only happened a couple of times. I had a lot of trouble with the equipment initially, setting it up, getting the antennas set up and working. And I was inexperienced, so all these things accumulated.
Exactly. But I suppose from her point of view, no news was good news, that if something had happened, she would presume somebody would eventually let her know.
You'd like to think so, but, you know, when you read the experience we had with that appendicectomy, that fellow that...
Can we come to that just a little bit later? Because, yes, I was going to ask you about that. But, we might as well talk about it right now, because that was incredible. Because this fellow, he was a Russian, wasn't he, who got a dreadful case of appendicitis, and he had to be operated out in the middle of nowhere, virtually, doesn't it, with very limited equipment.
Exactly. We were on our return from Dome C by this stage. It was a few days on our way. You know, we turned back for the station. We were about a few days into that, still about 1,000 kilometres from Muni. And his name was Valentin. He just reported one day to the doctor. He said, "Oh, Doc, I'm not feeling too well." And Slava, who was a doctor, quickly diagnosed, appendicitis. So I understand that it's not always necessary to do an operation, but anyway, Slava thought, well, we stop, we monitor the situation and see what happens. But as it turned out, he definitely needed a operation. He nearly, I don't know if the appendix had burst by this stage, but it was very close to that point. It was a life and death situation. Valentin survived it, in short, and Slava did a great job in very difficult conditions with poor equipment. The whole operation was done by torchlight and a couple of incandescent bulbs on a wooden table, and no general anaesthetic. I think he had a local anaesthetic. I don't know a lot about those details because, for security reasons, they didn't really want me to see, and they didn't want word to get out about what happened if it had gone bad.
Am I right in thinking that the Australians had to have their appendix out before
they went?
No,
that's not right.
Oh, no.
The doctors do, and that's typical of all countries. It is a widespread misunderstanding. No, the average expedition does not need to have their appendix out, never has. But that whole issue blew up in a doctor at Heard Island. I was back in the 60s where he had got to the point of taking out his own appendix too. And so this policy has been, I guess, mooted and talked about, but no, you don't have to.
The other thing I'm surprised, apart from appendicitis, you obviously didn't get that, but I'm surprised that you're still alive after having to live in such close proximity with all the Russians that smoked like chimneys and drank as though there was no tomorrow. So how did you survive all that?
I feel a bit the same.
You haven't had lung cancer.
Well, the smoke itself was one thing, but the aftermath, all the spitting and the dry sort of throat coughing and even during their sleep, the restless sleep that smoking causes. I didn't have any earplugs. That was the one regret, the thing that I didn't take. No one had mentioned you better take a bag full of earplugs. If I had, it might have made life a whole lot easier. But
it sounds extraordinary. And you did, to fill in the time and whatever, because there was obviously a lot of time that needed to be filled. You played chess, and that was some sort of diversion, wasn't it?
Chess was difficult. We had a chessboard, but I wasn't a skilled player. But we were too tired, really, at the end of an exhausting day to do a lot of that type of intellectual recreation. We sang a lot, and Slava would play the guitar, and we'd sing a lot. And that was a lot easier. Especially after a few vodkas.
Exactly.
But that was, Russians love to just, wrap their arms around each other and sing songs and
very
get up and dance. Yeah.
Yes. You're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is Trevor Hamley, the author of Vodka in a Vegemite Jar, a wonderful memoir of his time in Antarctica working with the Russians. Now, Trevor, it was cold, bitterly cold. If I'm right, at 3,489, I think it is, metres above sea level. You've got altitude sickness, and little wonder because it's 60% higher than Kosciuszko, is that right?
That's right, it's very high. If I said to you, well, is Australia a higher continent than Antarctica, most people probably wouldn't know. Oh. If I said to you that the average elevation of Antarctica ice mass is 2,500 metres and compare that with Australia's average elevation, which is 330 metres, I think that means something, and you go, wow, because Kosciuszko is only, I think, 2,600 metres high, something in that order, which is pretty much the average elevation of the Antarctic, yes. East Antarctic ice mass anyway. Very high, dry, cold and windy.
Well, you say in your book it can get to minus 90 degrees. I mean, how does anyone survive? And how many layers of clothes did you have to put on?
Well, I'd like to say happily, but I don't think happy is the right answer. They do survive quite comfortably, easily. The Russians, of course, know how to handle cold weather better than probably anyone. But the year before, I can't remember exactly the dates, but the crew that I met at Vostok had just experienced that world record minimum period where for 3 weeks, not only did they officially record the world record minimum of minus 89.2 in the Stevenson screen, for 3 weeks the temperature never got warmer than minus 75. Those sort of facts aren't recorded anywhere. I got this knowledge or this information from the meteorologist that had wintered there. A very cold period. But, like when you go outside, which these guys had to do just to move between, where they slept and worked and where they ate and visit other people every day, you're working in those, you have to get dressed up, and that's one of the probably most uncomfortable aspects of things, having to get all the clothes on to walk 100 or 200 metres and then take it all off when you get to the other end where the inside temperature's, say, plus 20. And you think about that, go, wow, that's maybe 100 degrees differential in temperature.
It's extraordinary, yes.
The OIC said to me, one of the things that tends to happen in those temperatures is eyelids freeze together. Well, it didn't happen to me because I was there in a much warmer period of the
minus 50 or something?
Oh, no. Well, not quite, but it did get to that on the Traverse. But when I was at Vostok, I think I was actually there in a heat wave. I recorded in my diary that it was minus 25 one day. I thought, well, that's pretty warm because their maximum at Vostok is minus 14.
Right.
So if you're talking about minus 25, that's actually very, very warm for that place.
You even had to wrap your feet up, I think. I think you said there that you found that was one of the hardest things, that you couldn't go out without, well, everything, I suppose, wrapped up. You got a little bit of frostbite once?
I did on the fingers. That was when I was a bit careless, taking photos with my glove off for a bit too long. My hands got a little bit of there was no permanent damage, just uncomfortable. It's like getting severe sunburn. The feet thing, the Russians were keen for me to wear their clothing and become part of it, which I wanted to do as well, and integrate, fully integrate. And one of the customs is to wear a boot called a Valenki. It's a felt boot. People who've travelled to the Soviet Union or perhaps have that kind of heritage would know what I'm talking about. But if you've seen movies as well, perhaps you know what I mean. And the way you wear this is you typically wrap your foot with rags or a strip cloth first, then you put on a light sock, and then you put your foot into this felt boot that has no sole or heel or anything. At first I found them quite uncomfortable and because I wasn't used to it, and I also thought that they were cold. But later in the trip I tried them again and felt that totally appropriate and fantastic. I love wearing them. And perhaps it was also the way I went about putting them on. Maybe I wasn't doing it very well. But yeah, that was part of the experience, and they gave me some their trousers to wear and so on. And the shapka, the Russian hat.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I enjoyed wearing, quite warm.
Did you keep in touch with any of them? I think you did with Vlad, did you?
Yes, I have lost contact with the guys that went back to Russia, but Vlad emigrated from about 30 years ago from Moscow to the US, he and his wife, who's a space scientist. And he's been there for 30 years. And he also has lost contact with these guys. He did do more trips to Antarctica with the Russians, and he's been to South Pole he works for the National Science Foundation and goes, or up until COVID, was going annually down to South Pole Station. Even up until a few years ago, he's still working for the National, but not travelling to Antarctica now. But I've lost contact with the main group. And I did ask Vlad when I was writing this book, it would be great to make contact with these guys. Could he help me to do that? But he said, no, it's just impossible at the moment.
Now, I don't know whether I'm going to say it right or not, but you spent a lot of time in a Kharkivanka, is it?
Kharkivanka. So you know the city of Kharkiv that everyone talks about in the Ukraine. That's the city, but for some reason they call it Kharkiv. I know it as Kharkov.
Right.
And Kharkivanka means the little lady from Kharkov city.
Oh, okay.
So that's a derivation of that word. The Kharkivanka is a unique Antarctic vehicle that the Russians used.
If I'm right, the Americans first started off making one, didn't it? And
it
didn't quite
vehicle.
work, and then the Russians perfected it. But look, I was so fascinated by it, I had to watch a YouTube video of one. So just for our listeners, perhaps you can tell us how it was sort of set up, how big it was, and how much time you spent inside one.
The Kharkivanka was constructed on the platform of what's called an ATT. It's basically artilleresky. I can't remember what the words are. ATT is a military vehicle used for pulling tanks and heavy artillery equipment, I think. So it had a tray on the back. So instead of the tray, they built a caravan on this ATT platform and called it a Kharkivanka. But they're a massive vehicle. It weighed, I think, in the order of 30 tonne. And inside the cabin at the back, you had sleeping quarters for three, like three bunks for three, a small fold-up table and shelves, and a dome in the roof for, scientific observations or whatever they wanted to do. Yeah, so it was basically a self-contained vehicle, with hot water. I think it had hot water.
But it didn't always go because when you were trying to get back to base, you had a lot of problems with it, didn't it? That it broke down and whatever.
All of the vehicles had problems with the tracks. The steel pins that hold the growser plates onto the wheels of the actual tracks, they would break regularly just because of brittle fracture being and that constant pressure of driving. And every day pretty much would be replacing pins. It was a major maintenance task. The actual Kharkivanka also had some electrical problems that were challenging, but mainly it was the tracks that were the problem.
And how many people would be on there living in there at one time?
Well, we had a field caravan with the other vehicle, so there were two prime movers, one an ATT and this Kharkivanka. The Kharkivanka pulled the bulk fuel. The fuel was stored in a big bulk fuel sled, and the Kharkivanka pulled that, and at times a store sled, and the other ATT pulled this living van. Most of the guys lived in the living van. There was 8 bunks, I think it was 8 in the living van. It was just like a caravan, for want of a more detailed description. The caravan had several different rooms. There was a room for the generator, there was a room for the radio operator, and then there was this main little kitchen and a main living area with bunks. And 3, so there were bunks for 3 in the Kharkivanka and 7 or 8, I can't remember exactly, in the living van. Right. And we had 9 people on the Travis team, so there was enough accommodation for even 1 or 2 more than we had.
So tell us what your average day would have been like there. And the food wasn't great, was it?
Well, we had
nothing to look forward to.
The food was certainly kept us alive, but it was pretty basic. One of the magnetologists from Molodezhny had volunteered to be the cook, not to be a scientist, but to act as a cook. And usually that task was given to the doctor because he normally you'd expect not to have a lot to do. So normally the doctor worked as a cook, but Slava didn't want to do that, or he didn't feel that he was very good at it. So we had another fellow doing it, and he cooked all the meals, prepared all the meals quite. He liked doing it. We ate a lot of pasta, or macaroni we called it. That was the mainstay. Tinned tuna, baked beans, tinned pork. I brought along quite a lot of condiments and stuff from Australia, Vegemite, peanut butter.
Well, nobody would have realised how popular a Vegemite jar would be. Tell us about that.
It was popular. Well, these guys, of course, in those days, for people who are old enough, remember the Vegemite jars that had a removable lid on the top. So once you'd emptied the contents, you could use it.
Pleasant glass.
Yeah, it is a very pleasant glass. And a lot of homes in Australia in the 50s and 60s, that's all they had were Vegemite glasses. They were all of their drinking glasses. So these guys didn't know that or didn't realise that at first. So when we emptied our first jar, of course, I was quick to grab it and start using it as my drinking glass instead of a screw top jar or a enamel mug. And when a couple of them saw that, they decided, nope, they were going to appropriate that, and if I wanted it, I have to wrestle for it.
Oh, right. So they waited for you to finish your Vegemite so that another one would come on.
Well, we only had a couple of jars actually on the trip, so there wasn't a lot to go around. There wasn't enough for everyone. But I was pretty happy to not suffer a wrestling match with these guys too.
I would imagine so. But there was a lot of vodka drunk, wasn't there?
We did drink a lot, actually. Yeah.
Well, it was so cold. It had something to keep you warm.
Well, they brewed their own. On our way back, I remember Vlad pointing to this drum being towed behind one of the tractor trains, and he just said, Trev, hey, look over there. See that drum? And it was being pulled behind us. And he goes, vodka.
Oh, really?
It was a 44-gallon drum.
Was it good?
I didn't try that particular batch.
Right.
My stuff, the stuff that I drank came from the commercial bottles.
Oh, right. But you were very lucky to get out in the end, weren't you? Because the weather was so bad. And that's when, go back to you sort of said, well, the worst comes to the worst, I'll learn Russian. But it was a bit dicey, wasn't it, there for a while?
It was dicey, yeah. We came back in March. The ship, it wasn't clear what voyage or how I'd exactly get home to Australia. I mean, I knew I'd have to come out in the ship, but which voyage and what ship, that wasn't clear. But the sea ice was very bad and it was late. It was like April, and that's very, very late to be evacuating people from the Antarctica in April. But eventually the ships came in, but one of them was an icebreaker and the other ship was that was going to take most of the expeditions back to Russia was a regular tourist ship. It wasn't ice strengthened. Right. It was white with a V-shaped hull, and it was following this icebreaker into Mirny. So to cut a long story short, the captain got a little bit scared of the conditions and backtracked, and we ended up having to get in lifeboats and travel down the coast to the icebreaker and then transfer at sea across to this other vessel a few days later.
But you did eventually get home, and needless to say, Kerry was very, very happy to meet you
yes.
there on the dock. But as was.
Well, I met Kerry. Kerry actually met me at Tullamarine. I flew back to Melbourne and met her there. Because the whole thing was awkward to be exact about anything, exactly what time or when we would arrive and where.
Now, if people want to get hold of your book, which I've read, and it's a fascinating read, how do they go about doing that?
So the easiest way is to go to my website, trevorhamley.com, trevorhamley.com, and order it online from me, and I can post it to anywhere in Australia, or in fact overseas as well, but it's a little bit more expensive to do it overseas.
Right. Or do what I did and download it on Kindle.
That's correct. So it's available on all ebook platforms, Kindle, Apple Books, you name it, Kobo,
yes.
And a lot less expensive that way as well. And it does also have the photos included in the electronic ebook.
Which is terrific. So, Trevor Hamley, the author of Vodka in a Vegemite Jar, thanks so much for being with us today. It's been fascinating to hear about that time that you spent there with the Russians and how you survived, all the smoke, the snoring, the vodka and everything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.